Hey, hey, from Vardø, an Arctic Norwegian fishing port on a deformed butterfly-shaped island in the Barents Sea. This is the most easterly town in Norway. If I go due south from here, I'm in Russia. I'm east of Kyiv, east of Istanbul, closer to China than I am to Portugal. And this is the starting point of the longest point-to-point journey you can make by public transport on the surface, entirely within the Schengen Zone. 5,500 kilometers, or perhaps a little bit more as the crow flies. And we're about to try that in 200 hours, or maybe a bit less. It's going to take a lot of trains, a lot of buses, and also a few boats. Here comes our first one. Vardø has 2,000 people and one tree. The tree is this spindly little rowan specimen huddled behind the walls of the world's most northerly fortress on the western wing of that butterfly-shaped island. The fort has a quiet life from its commissioning in the 18th century until 1940, when it was the last military installation to fly the Norwegian flag. It's still technically under military command, but it has reverted to a quiet life as a saluting station. Salutes are fired for things like the King's birthday, but also when the full disk of the sun is first seen at the end of the polar night. The town's school kids get the rest of the day off in celebration. The eastern butterfly wing of the island is now the more active military site, from whose hilltop radar domes stare eerily out across the Varanger Fjord to Russia and its Barents Sea naval bases, barely 50 miles distant. But for true eeriness, nothing matches the extraordinary pair of monuments at Stalneset, just below the fortress. The county of Finnmark did a lot of witch accusing, and the town of Vardø did most of all. In the 1621 witch trials, 77 women and 14 men were burned at the stake here. The darkened interior of the suspended cocoon, designed by Swiss architect Peter Zumthor, contains a single light bulb for each of the 91 executed, alongside their biographies, while next door is the black glass box, which is the final piece of work of Louise Bourgeois, an eternal flame burning from a chair, reflecting in the mirrors above like judges surrounding the condemned. It's an astonishing and terrifying thing to find on this desolate, remote shore. Every day, more or less on the dot of 4:05 p.m, what I'm going to call the coastal steamer, for reasons of romance, even if this one is powered by LPG and batteries, slides into Vardø's narrow harbour entrance. Indeed, every day since 1936, barring war and pandemic, ships have left Bergen in southwest Norway and Kirkenes right beside the Russian border on this 7-day, 34-port voyage linking settlements along Norway's jagged, contorted coast, the second longest coastline of any nation on Earth. The coastal service, known as the Hurtigruten or Express Route, now conveys a weird mixture of German, American and Norwegian cruisers on all-inclusive packages costing many thousands of euros, dollar or krona, and a handful of people hopping port to port for basically the equivalent of the bus fare. On board our first conveyance, the 2022 built Havila Castor, we're in the latter category. It's appropriate that our first leg on this attempt to make one of the longest journeys in Europe is itself the longest single public transport journey, by time, on the continent. But while we're not going anything like the full route to Bergen, we're on board long enough for it to be worthwhile for me to splash out a relatively small supplement for the most basic cabin, rather than a reclining chair. And so we start the clock on this challenge at 16:58 Central European summertime, when the Castor's crew casts us off from Vardø Quay 2 minutes early. We silently edge out between the breakwaters under battery power, departing the second stop on the Hurtigruten's southbound schedule, which, confusing at this point, has our ship travelling northwestwards as we head round the remote north coast of Finnmark County. We now have 200 hours to reach the most distant point accessible by surface public transport in the Schengen Zone, the open border area that celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. On the one hand, it's looking a little ragged as some of its most major members reinstate border checks, supposedly on a temporary basis. On the other hand, it has continued to grow, with 3 new members this decade, taking it to 29 states, including 4 non-EU nations, of which Norway is of course one. In this challenge, I'm using it as a bit of a proxy for Europe's longest public transport journey, and as a way to avoid getting into YouTube arguments about whether Europe is a geographical or political concept, and therefore what it includes, or whether I should be starting in Russia, a nation I have no desire to visit currently. So for the next 8 or so days, we're going to make our way towards another small fishing port, 5,650 kilometres away as the crow flies, much further as the public transport goes, leaping from ferry to train to bus and back again. It's a tight schedule and could easily fall apart. Indeed, a big hole in the route appeared a few days before we set off, but also, in parts, it'll be oddly relaxed, allowing us to make some slightly eccentric routing choices for the sake of interest. To be honest, I'd envisaged that putting out into the Barents Sea, underneath which the Russian Northern Fleet's Yasin-class submarines are playing their dangerous game of cat and mouse with a NATO fleet led by USS Gerald R. Ford, would be more in the manner of Captain Ramius screwing his face into a biting Arctic wind and cursing, and less of the swanning around in t-shirts experience of today. That said, nearly everyone else on deck as we leave Vardø behind is a German pensioner in approximately 56 layers of expensive outdoor wear. As befits her status as half cruise ship, half coastal ferry, the Castor is a pretty plush bubble on the Barents Sea, replete with sauna, hot tubs, sofas on the deck, lounges with jigsaws, including the Castor herself, and TV screens showing constant loops of log fires. All very hygge, and importantly for my personal hygge, I've located the free coffee machine, which will be vital when I disembark at 4 AM the morning after next. It's a golden Arctic evening as we sail past the mouth of the Siltefjord, the sky the colour of cloudberries. It's an incredibly silent progress on this battery-powered ship, the only sound being the whir of the radar scanner and the slight rustle of the bow through the water. We pass the white speck of a lighthouse and begin to turn into the 10-mile-long dead-end Budsfjorden towards its namesake town, which will be our first stop since Vardø. There'd better be some passengers or freight waiting for us at the end of this long deviation. As the Castor is swung round on a sixpence or perhaps a 5 kroner piece at the head of this narrow fjord, there's a strong smell of fish from the town of Budsfjord, unsurprising for somewhere that gets 10,000 fishing boat arrivals per year. There's one passenger on and one off here. It may seem odd to send a 15,000-ton ship on a 20-mile diversion for such slim pickings, but serving isolated towns like this, where roads are indirect and air travel is expensive and weather dependent, is why the Norwegian government specifies this service. As we curve northwestwards out of the Budsfjorden, the partially eclipsed blood moon illuminates our wake and the fluttering Norwegian post pennant, whose presence signifies we're carrying mail. I'm just sinking into a comfy chair in the bar for an aquavit-based cocktail that is surprisingly affordable given I'm in Norway and on a boat, when I notice much skyward gazing on the part of the passengers out on deck. Early September ought to be too early for the Aurora Borealis, but high solar activity gives us magical, iridescent swirls of unnatural green high above us. "We have some northern lights outside in the sky," announces the captain nonchalantly and trilingually, in case anyone expects them to be localised entirely within the kitchen. A couple of crew members have been working hard ever since I boarded to get the recalcitrant hot tubs working, attempting to placate keen would-be users with promises of their being fixed imminently. Wandering onto deck just before 11 PM, I find they have finally succeeded, long after nearly everyone else has gone to bed. This challenge will get rather more demanding soon, but for now, I can at least say I've lazed in the hot tub while being transported through the Arctic Ocean at 13 knots per hour. In the silent early hours of the morning, with the ship to myself, we ride a river of moonlight into a bay to tie up at the wooden quayside of Mehamn, where 2 lonely travellers await us from its population of 700. At Whitsuntide in 1903, this was a less peaceful spot, as the town's fishing families rose up against the local whaling station. Whales, they believed, chased fish towards the shore. The killing of the whales meant the fish stayed out at sea, harder to harvest. By the time the military arrived from Vardø, the whaling station and its machinery had been destroyed. In the general election held later that year, the nascent Norwegian Labour Party stood on the platform of conserving whales, entering Parliament for the first time with 4 seats in Mehamn and similar northern fishing ports. In a few hours, the polls will open in the 2025 Norwegian general election, and the electoral powerhouse that was born from whale conservation in Mehamn over 120 years ago looks set to top the polls again. As the speckling of warm lights in Mehamn disappear astern, it's time to turn in. This isn't fast transport, but it is time efficient. The only bit of transport this far north that will keep ploughing on through the night. While we sleep, the castor will round the most northerly point of the natural European mainland at Kinnerøden. The more famous Nordkap is actually on an island, albeit one now linked by road tunnel to the continent. Under the pink light of morning, still with the ship mostly to ourselves, we slip into Honningsvåg, with its dumpy, primary-coloured ocean-going fishing boats, the main town of the island of Margarøya, home of Nordkap, but also of Nifsjøladen, the actual most northerly point of linked by ground transport Europe. Nordkap suffers from the surprisingly common John O'Groats syndrome, where convenience of access wins out over geographical reality when it comes to extreme points. Another group of early risers is corralled for a shore excursion for breakfast at the North Cape. In the original plan, I was due to get off here too, to continue south by bus, but a few days before I departed, Norway's sole railway and motorway to the far north was swallowed up by a quick clay landslide near Trondheim, though I strongly suspect it was actually trolls. The plan for an all-Norwegian journey to the Skagerrak had to be abandoned. Under the old plan, I needed to be in Narvik first thing tomorrow morning. Now I only need to be there mid-morning, meaning I can stick with the Hurtigruten for longer. I'm very grateful to the nice person from Havila who kindly amended my definitely unamendable cheap ticket. Sailing away from Honningsvåg, there's a point where it feels like the captain is heading the castor straight at an unbroken line of hills. Of course, the captain knows best, and at the last minute a gap opens up and we can swing starboard up the narrow Margarøya channel between island and mainland, sailing beneath the bleak tundra and scree-sided hills in order to regain the open sea. At 7 AM, I decide it's time to briefly tear myself away from the scenery and profit from everyone still being asleep to use something most public transport vehicles don't have, a free self-service laundry. This will probably be more helpful in a few days' time, but gather ye freshly laundered underwear while you may when you're travelling is my motto. We pull into the little town of Havøysund, hiding in its eponymous strait, shadowed by the stark pyramidal Nipfellet. One passenger and one box are loaded aboard here. Some may consider the use of a forklift for that size of a box to be overkill, but not Havøysund's stevedores. One of the events on board the coastal steamer is the twice daily passing of the ships coming the other way, which is marked with much blowing of horns, flashing of searchlights and waving of Norwegian flags. This morning's northbound ship is our identical quad Havila Polaris, running about 20 minutes late. As we approach Hammerfest, a crew member invites us all up onto deck 8 so he can show us why, in his words, Norway has so much money. This is the liquefied natural gas terminal on the island of Melkøya, Milk Island, where gas from the Snow White field comes ashore, the end uses of which include powering our ship. The Hurtigruten timetable provides for a 90-minute stop at Hammerfest, which may be the world's most northerly town or city, though both Honningsvåg and Longyearbyen on Svalbard quibble about those definitions. While we now turn southeastwards, we're still just about north of our starting point in Vardø. A steady stream of Hammerfest citizens are making their way past the civic polar bear honour guard and 2 cruise ships worth of camera-toting tourists to vote in the town hall. Climbing the hill behind the town, I encounter my first proper trees since Vardø. I say proper because much of the greenery in these latitudes is dwarf willows, which, while never getting more than 6 centimetres high, are in fact technically trees. Hammerfest was briefly occupied by the Royal Navy in 1802 when the Kingdom of Denmark and Norway was allied with Bonaparte. During the occupation, sailors stole the church's offering box. While this doesn't really rank with the burning of the city to the ground by the Wehrmacht during the next occupation of the town, it's not playing the game, lads. Perhaps uniquely for small town councils, Hammerfest Municipality's Wikipedia page has a section headed Reindeer Problems. Every summer, hundreds of them invade the town, causing inevitable hygiene issues. The council built a 20-kilometre long fence around the town to keep them out, but as you can see, to no avail. As befits this open border, fence-free challenge, I say, good on you, Schengen resident reindeer. We leave Hammerfest past the weirdly shaped island of Hoya, which once provided a one-stop larder for the town's residents. Seagull eggs from the cliff face, berries from the gentle slopes. Now the coastal steamer runs southwest, past the mainland and the seemingly endless mountain wall of Savoia Island, patches of last winter's snow still sitting in the shady cirques. Savoia is Norway's fourth largest island, but has a population of barely 1,000. The scenery continues to be absolutely stunning, with endless blues, greens and shifting light as the mountains grow taller. I get distracted from it, however, by a text from the Swedish Railways telling me that their line south to Stockholm has been cut, the sleeper train cancelled, and no replacement bus can be organised. Yesterday, while we were sunning ourselves in the Arctic, 1,000 millimetres of rain fell in parts of Sweden, washing out railway tracks and causing a train carrying ammunition and lithium batteries, what a combination, to derail. That means both of Scandinavia's main north-south railways are shut, with us on the wrong side of them, and no suitable long-distance coaches. I have a phone chat with Pia from the Swedish Railways. She's as charming and helpful as she can be, but there's not a lot she can do. It's never great when a phone call to a railway company ends with them wishing you good luck. However, by the time we're pulling into beautiful Uxfjord, Ux is from axe, not ox apparently, I think I might have found a fragile workaround. Tomorrow night is going to be interesting. In 1941, the Norwegian Navy landed at Uxfjord in a borrowed British destroyer, Mansfield, in order to briefly show the flag and blow up a fish oil factory. They left with the citizens standing on the pier, singing the national anthem. Ploughing on southwards, we are, for a moment, on the edge of the open Norwegian Sea, before we round the point of uninhabited Silda Island in the early evening light. As we power towards the 1,000-metre plus peaks of Arnøya Island, it's time to go and investigate dinner. Port-to-port passengers are largely confined to the little cafe rather than the fine dining restaurant, but no complaints from me. I'm not sure if a Caesar salad with rösti is really traditional Norwegian cuisine, or indeed anyone's traditional cuisine, but it is lovely, fresh and part of a very decent vegetarian range in a non-veggie friendly country. As the Castor approaches Charave, she enters what is almost a vast natural harbour, ringed by mountainous islands and peninsulas, hillsides and snow patches glinting in the evening light. It's silent, majestic and almost sacred. It feels a privilege to be gliding miraculously through it. Approaching from the sea, you don't see surprisingly large Charave hidden in a wooded bay until the last minute. 26 hours in, we finally left Finnmark County to enter Troms, and had we been doing this from 2020 to 2023 when the counties were briefly and controversially merged, it'd be many more hours before we left the first county. Squeezing westwards from Charave through a maze of darkening islands, 9 PM strikes and the first exit polls from the general election are published. As expected, Labour has topped the poll, but the hard right Progress Party comes a strong second. Weirdly, the crew are busy running a 9 PM rock and roll quiz rather than an election night watch party. Havila is a newcomer around here. Until 2021, the monopoly on the Hurtigruten service was held by the Hurtigruten company. Then the government decided to split the contract in three, Hurtigruten winning 2 contracts and new company Havila 1, meaning they run the departures on 4 days out of every 11. Today's second northbound ship that we cross is a Hurtigruten vessel, but in coastal steamer solidarity we still salute it as much as we did the Havila ship earlier. The northbound ship is the Richard Whiff, named after the chap who had the idea of the coast steamer in the 1880s and charted the almost lighthouseless, poorly mapped, treacherous coastline to enable the 24-hour-a-day operation that is proving so efficient for this journey. Thanks, Vicky. Guided by faint northern lights, we sail up the Tromsfjord. After many hours in the wilds, Tromsø seems huge as its lights crowd in from both sides of the fjord. The original town on its mid-fjord island to the right, facing the suburb of Tromsdalen with the peaked Arctic Cathedral, actually a parish church, soaring above the water. The Castor squeezes under the Tromsøbrua, the first bridge encountered when heading south along the steamer route, constraining the size of vessels that can operate on it. As a little exodus of passengers leaves the ship to head to a midnight concert at the cathedral, I'm heading for my cosy cabin because I have to get off this ferry at the next stop at a time I don't want to think too much about. 4 a.m. and I've bid our warm cabin and comfy bed farewell. The Castor is picking her way down the 35-kilometre long Gisundet Strait, guided by the flashing navigation beacons. The compensation for being awake is that it's beautiful and utterly silent. One moment it's clear, the next we're in a thick patch of mist out of which emerges the filigree Finn Gisundbrua, the link to the island of Senja. That's my cue to head downstairs for disembarkation. The only other people awake seem to be the steward and the cleaner, engaging in a little light flirting. I feel guilty for interrupting this, and indeed that I may have caused a 15,000-ton ferry to tie up at Finnsnes just for me, but luckily it turns out there's a solid cargo of fish to be loaded aboard for points south. I wave a sad goodbye to the Castor, her coffee, pastries and fake open fires. I've 2 hours to wait in a workday Norwegian town at 4:30 a.m. Though I did buy one of the ship's fine pastries to tide me through it. I purchased this last night, and as they don't really do takeaways, all the cafe lady could offer me to carry it in was a seasickness bag. As Finnsnes' comfy and warm-looking combined bus and express boat station doesn't open until precisely 10 minutes before my bus leaves, I'm eating the pastry beside this statue of local lad Ottar the Viking, allegedly the first person to tell King Alfred of England about the existence of Norway. There's also some purple jellyfish in the clear water to keep us company. So we've waved goodbye to our comfy ship, the Castor, and from now on things get a bit more rough and ready. The journey's been thrown a little bit into upheaval by the fact that as of 2 days ago, every railway line linking southern Scandinavia and northern Scandinavia has been cut either by landslides or flooding. I think I've worked a way around that. It's going to be quite an intense 24 hours and absolutely pivotal. Here's my bus, basically a school service to a high school 44 kilometres away in Vardø. They make their school kids get up early in Norway, which also provides some useful connections into trunk long-distance bus routes. Climbing away from the sea, we skirt the chilly waters of the huge Finnfjord Vatne lake, the driver giving a cheery hey hey to every schoolchild as they board. They respond as you'd expect a teenager who has to get a 6:40 a.m. bus to school would. Into the forests, and it's a golden morning with the early clouds hanging in the trees. One thing I don't really understand in Norway is the exactitude of the moose warning signs. How do they know there are exactly 1.6 kilometres of moose? I don't trust political pollsters who publish decimal places, and I'm extending that to road sign designers. The bus drops its non-school passengers at a road junction petrol station in the middle of nowhere, allegedly called Buktamar. This is quite a little interchange for this corner of Troms County, with real-time information screens and a little shelter by the side of a burnt-down pub. Generally, Norwegian rural buses are infrequent but well coordinated. I have, inevitably, hit on the exception and have over an hour in this pretty but rather desolate spot. Fortunately, the Circle K petrol station can keep me fed in mediocre cinnamon rolls until my bus turns up, doing a lap of honour around the site of the burnt-down pub. This is the number 100, an important number for an important bus, linking Tromsø and Narvik, where it will connect with another 100, the border, following the spinal E6 main road, Norway's sole land route to the far north. We speed along the dewy, sometimes misty, sometimes sunny valley, calling occasionally at lane ends by banks of post boxes to pick up people heading to the next scattered settlement to shop. At several pass summits, there's carefully planned interchanges with local buses that have wound their way up from villages at fjord level, pulling up door to door to limit weather exposures for interchanging passengers, though that's hardly necessary today. The astonishingly placid waters of the lake at Lapphaugen belie that we are now within the battlefield of the insanely destructive 1940 Battle of Narvik. A clash here saw the first point at which German forces were repelled. And now the 100 itself is twisting down from the fells towards the deep blue Narvik fjord below. Down at sea level, we approach Narvik over the Halokalandsbro, opened in 2018 to cut off a huge loop around a side fjord, and now the longest suspension bridge within the Arctic Circle, if that's an important distinction. Narvik is, famously, an ice-free deep-water port for the Swedish iron ore mines, hence the sheer amount of blood and treasure expended over its control. It has the most northerly railway station in Norway, but trains run only to Sweden along the Malmbanan, 95% of whose purpose is the transport of iron ore. So it's time for our first train of this trip. Except, of course, it's not the train on the left, it's the rail replacement bus on the right. I was not hugely surprised to see Erstatningsbuss in the timetable when I was rapidly replanning yesterday. The monster iron ore trains mean that the Malmbanan needs a lot of maintenance, and the short summer months are when it has to be done. Downside, this means we missed the most spectacular bit of the train journey, clinging to the side of the fjords on the climb to the border. Upside, as the bus is actually faster than the train, it leaves later, meaning I had a 30-minute connection at Narvik, not the 10-minute nail-biter under the normal timetable. Our bus driver eschews the Halokalandsbro and instead takes us over the 50-year-old, more fragile-looking Rombak bridge across its namesake fjord, probably our final proper fjord. Soon we are 300 metres above the sea, in the most stunning, contorted, complex landscape, mile upon mile of red berries, glacially smooth rock, glinting blue lakes, and perched between them all, cute little cottages in Falu red. Up on these high moors we cross our first border, the ruler-straight frontier into Sweden, driving straight through as you should in Schengen, with just the colours of the pennants on the cabins changing colour, as we arrive at the unimaginatively named village of Riksgränsen, which just means state border. Here a Schengen benefit is that skiers can use the cross-border pistes without there being e-gates halfway down the hill. I'm celebrating the first border crossing with one of Sweden's finest products, along with billy bookcases and Jungelskog. The scum was purchased in Norway at some vastly exaggerated price. A further advantage of the rail replacement bus is that a hiker convinced the driver to drop her at a remote trailhead some way from any station. I doubt the driver of the intercity we are replacing would have been quite so obliging. For some time our bus follows the shores of the immense 70-kilometre long deep blue Turnitrask Lake. Coming to the station at Biskau Östra, which has one of the many fortress-like electrical substations built to power the Malmbanan, a bizarre bit of operation, which must make sense to someone, occurs. We're all turfed off the bus, which then disappears off back towards Norway. A few minutes later, the second bus that has been standing at Narvik station appears, empty, and sweeps us all up for the final leg to Kiruna. Bizarre. We roll on through Swedish Lapland, the landscape slowly changing to being dominated by stunted silver birch, the first hints of autumn in their leaves. After a 170-kilometre long rail replacement bus journey, the scarred hillsides, mine workers' apartment blocks, and steam-blowing industry of Kiruna appears. This is a factory town par excellence, built here in the absolute middle of nowhere, solely to serve the LKAB iron ore mine. Famously, Kiruna's town centre was moved to make way for mine expansion. The month before I came here, the world watched as the town's church was moved in a single piece. This month, it was announced that a further 6,000 residents would have to be relocated due to earth cracking from the mine. And while I've passed through Kiruna by train before, I stopped at an entirely different, now disappeared station, now replaced by this rather minimalist halt as the old rail route was in the way of iron ore extraction. In Kiruna, the mine comes first. But from here, the train service restarts. A tiny train, locomotive and 2 coaches in the distinctive Swedish corrugated style. Neither coach carries the number my reserved seat is supposed to be in, but it's pretty quiet, so we'll wing it. The coaches are archaic, but they are huge, the refurb colourful, and there's even a little buffet counter hiding up at the end. Delighted to be on the rails, Mrs. Turtle observes our departure past Lusavara Mountain, before we slowly slip our way out of Kiruna past the endless grey spoil heaps. The buffet counter is quite limited in its range, but definitely worth investigating. You know you're in Sweden when the tang of cardamom appears in the pastries, and that you're no longer in Norway when there's change from £4 for a coffee and a pastry. Out of Kiruna, and the landscape settles down into a cycle of scrubby wood, golden marsh and wide rivers, a countryside that screams berries, wild mushrooms, mosquitoes, bears. Towns are very few and far between out here. After an hour or so comes the junction with the summer-only inland railway at Gällivare. Then we drift through the request stop at Nattavaara, lost in the middle of the multi-hued woods. It has everything a station needs: a waiting shelter, a modern electronic information system. Oh, except a platform, that is. Approaching a hamlet and passing loop called Polscirkeln was a clue that, nearly 48 hours in, we're finally about to leave the Arctic. There are two signs next to the line, first the 2015 Arctic Circle, then the 2005 one. It is, confusingly, contracting. Time for a 2025 sign to be installed, surely? The guard occasionally announces points and places of interest. The first time he announced a naughty line-side moose inside the moose-proof railway fence, we passed it by the time he got to the English translation. The second time round I'm forewarned, and there's a very fleeting glimpse of the creature as it trots along among the bushes. Eventually, we arrive at Boden, an army town almost on the east coast of Sweden. I ought to be alighting here to join the waiting Stockholm sleeper on the opposite platform. Because of the washouts, it doesn't exist, so I'm sitting tight on this train to its terminus at Luleå on the coast itself, from where I hope to make my way south to Umeå, which might open up a route to Stockholm. Through unmistakable, neat, semi-rural Sweden, and the battered little train from the Arctic pulls into Luleå slightly early. The town smells delightfully of freshly cut timber. I've two choices now: a long bus to Umeå that will give me nearly 3 very early morning hours to kill there, or the train, leaving shortly, that will give me a little over 4 hours there. At this point I happen to glance at how much the Swedish Railway will reimburse me for a hotel in lieu of my cancelled sleeper. It's generous. Decision made. Even for the shortest night's sleep, if I'm getting up at 4 for a second morning in a row, I'm going to milk them for an Umeå hotel room. The train it is. Originally, I should have spent tonight in a private sleeper from Trondheim to Oslo. Then that became a shared sleeper from Boden to Stockholm. A downgrade to a bus shelter in Umeå is a step too far. I rapidly pull together an ecumenical salad from the Co-op's high-tech salad bar, resist the temptation of the frisbee-sized crisp breads, and scoot back to the station with a few minutes to spare before the sleek regional train, the last train of the day out of Luleå with all the cancellations, heads south. We retrace our steps up the line to Boden. I decided not to spend a few hours here because it frankly looked dull in the way that inland northern Swedish towns specialise in, a sort of Aldershot stroke crew hybrid without the edge. Then it's dinner time as we accelerate into the gathering dark and the thick pine forests. Swedish trains are big. They can accommodate 3x2 seating and still feel generous, but that does mean that when they are empty, they feel very empty. I'm genuinely surprised to find that there is a little buffet counter on this regional train too, run by the guard, which is good because it means that for my dessert course I can continue my odyssey through Swedish confectionery that sounds very dodgy if you're English. A night journey on a stopping train always has an air of mystery about it. What is this little town that suddenly appears in the midst of the darkness? Why is Jörn here? What do its people do? And did Vladimir Lenin wonder the same when his train from Zurich called here in 1917, its final stop in Sweden en route to the Finland station? At 11 p.m. we call at Vännäs, where our train, which is now annoyingly late because I want to get to bed, reverses for a second time. For defensive reasons, Sweden built its main north-south railway well inland, leaving coastal cities like Luleå and Umeå at the ends of branch lines from junctions like this. At Umeå at last, actually just 20 minutes late, though the endless waits in the dark to cross freight trains made it feel much more, where it's very important that the train stops at the far end of the platform so we can enjoy a lengthy walk in the drizzle. Thankfully, the rather classy hotel that I'm hoping Svenska Järnväg will eventually cough up for is barely a minute's walk from the station, as I just want one thing: a very brief spell in bed.
It's 4:30 in the morning again. I don't really approve of that. I'm on a very, very quiet train. This is basically our only option if we want to try and get to where we need to be by the end of today. In about an hour's time, this train will run out of usable railway line, and we're going to have to do battle with rail replacement buses again to get round the washout on the Botnia-Barnen.
It's never ideal when you check in and check out of a hotel during the same receptionist shift, but needs must in order to join the tour of passengers on this blurg o'clock train south. I'm very grateful to the friendly guard for giving me a coffee from her little bistro. In her words, I deserve a free drink because it's a long bus journey once the rails run out. Those weren't her actual words, as we're communicating in a mixture of Swedish, English and a sort of Germano-Dutch with added sign language. Alas, in none of those languages, including English, am I fluent enough to ask if I can have the constellation effect lighting in this weird lounge at the end of the train turned on, please. We're running along the Botnia-Barnen, a new coast-paralleling railway that's slowly replacing the old north-south main line. Sweden is clearly no longer scared that the Finns will invade and slice their strategic rail corridor. This bit south of Umeå opened in 2010. The section north of Umeå might just about manage to open this century. Örnsköldsvik is as far as we can get before the damaged section of railway. We're meeting again with our old friend, Ersättningstrafik. Though that does mean I also get to make the acquaintance of Örnsköldsvik's really quite impressive integrated bus and train station, all the more impressive given the rail platforms are a good 30 metres up the hillside above the harbour level buses. Said hillside also incorporates the world's only ski jump where if you judge it wrong you could end up in the pastries section of a Circle K petrol station. My rail replacement bus left the station, I'm certain, just when it was due. It's also the only rail replacement bus I've ever taken where the driver has given a bilingual announcement introducing himself, the stops en route and expected arrival times at them all. Misty motorways give way to misty minor roads as we weave around and over the fjords of the high coast. That's not a mispronunciation, well it probably is, but not deliberately. A fjord is a flooded glacial depression, while a fjord generally has cliffs and is more glacially carved. Whisper it, quite a lot of Norwegian fjords are in fact fjords. At times, the rail replacement bus, in place because of a washed out railway, is having to divert itself because of roads washed away by the same torrential rain. Unlike yesterday's rail replacement bus from Narvik, which outpaced the train timetable, this one is no match for the 125 mph schedule of the parallel railway. The nice guard was quite right that there was no way I'd make the morning express to Stockholm from Sundsvall, so I'm mentally waving the complimentary breakfast I had booked on it farewell at this point. But eventually, we do pull into misty Sundsvall, past the handsome city centre known as Stenstan, meaning Stone Town. It's called that because, impressively, Sundsvall and Umeå managed to burn down on the same day in June 1888. Noting the highly flammable nature of Swedish towns, Sundsvall's town fathers took the decision to rebuild in stone. In another bit of forward thinking, a transport planner had the clever idea to dig a hollow in front of Sundsvall's railway station and put a bus station in it for another bit of stylish bi-level integration. Lovely contemporary glass sculptures in the bus station downstairs, beautiful historic Nordic station hall upstairs. Though the actual platforms do suffer from being accessible only by level crossing, an issue if a lengthy empty log train is trundling past when you want to reach your own train. Having missed the morning express direct to the capital, we're relying on regional operator with a silly name X-Torget for our next leg south. Having also missed out on my free breakfast from the national operator, I've instead stocked myself up from the Pressbyråns shop on Sundsvall station, an institution whose founding principle seems to be, what if W.H. Smiths on railway stations were, and hear me out here guys, actually good? It's mile upon mile of absolutely classic Swedish Midlands scenery as we scoot smoothly down the line south from Sundsvall. That soothing, mesmerising cycle of lakes, islands, woods and red cabins, then on to prosperous-looking farms, whitewashed classical 19th century churches, contented cows and ripening crops as we curve through the countryside of Gävleborg County. And so to Gävle, famed for being the oldest town in northern Sweden, though barely in the north, for being pronounced completely differently from how an Anglophone would expect, for that Christmas goat that goes on fire a lot, and for the huge koi carp in the station's ornamental moat. Well, maybe not so much the last one. It's a very short connection here onto one of SJ's Hippo-esque double-deck intercity trains. It makes a change to be back on the national operator. The last 3 Swedish regional trains we've taken have all been run under contract by the Norwegian State Railway, or V as it now unaccountably calls itself. Through the endless serried ranks of pines we race, southwards towards the capital. Despite being double-deck, this train could really do with a third carriage, full as it is with our lander-bound aviators and those seeking the flesh pots of Stockholm. We pause briefly at Uppsala, a great university city whose alumni include Carl Linnaeus, the founder of modern taxonomy, and Anders Celsius, who could, perhaps between them, have invented the game Hot or Not. And in we come to the Stockholm suburbs, the distinctive low-rise skyline of early 20th century apartments and medium-rise post-war blocks, with little glimpses of water in between. It's our first capital of the journey. That should have been Oslo at 7 AM this morning, but there's no use crying over spilt quick clay. In Journey Plan 2.0, where I arrived here early in the morning on the sleeper from the north, I had many exciting plans for the free morning in Stockholm that would give me. Canne brûlée in the Gamla Stan, commuter ferries, buses that go on boats, that sort of thing. In post-rainstorm Plan 2.2, I've got precisely 44 minutes to admire the Stadhuset, City Hall, Nobel Prize dinner venue and the finest bit of 20th century municipal brick architecture outside of Greenwich, stare across the water to the eclectic skyline of the old town through which road and rail slice mercilessly, watch the arrival of the 124-year-old steamer Prince Carl Philip on its timetabled journey back from the Royal Palace at Drottningholm. Then, all too soon, it's back to the next door central station, where the stunning original train shed was, by the 1920s, too small for the rail traffic and so was converted into a booking and waiting hall. The less said about the ugly concrete platforms round the back, the better, other than the super view to the old town from their southern ends. It's a relief to be catching our fast train south, the absolute last service we could have caught from here without the whole journey falling apart. It's a long time since I've ridden on one of these 1990s vintage X2000 tilting trains, and I'm keen to try out the refurb. I'm also delighted that 2 hours ago, a first-class seat suddenly became available, everything bar the single second-class aisle seat having previously been full. And so, yeah for now, Stockholm. I do think heading south from here is nearly as iconic a departure by rail as that from Cologne. I can report that the X2000 refurbishment is superb, at least in first class. Huge, comfy reclining seats, gentle refined lighting, great big tables, those classy touches of wood effect that give many Swedish trains their fresh from IKEA look. Terrible seat alignment to windows in some of the rows, though thankfully not mine. As ever, I'm a big fan also of the help yourself to hot drinks and apples counter. I've never yet crossed the impressive viaduct at Södertälje on the southern fringes of Stockholm and it not be pouring with rain. I'm convinced the place has some sort of weird microclimate. It's also the port from which much of Sweden's car production is shipped for export. Your Saab probably got rusty in those parking lots. Sun's out again and Mrs. Turtle is enjoying her introduction to southern Swedish landscapes. It's bringing back lots of memories for me of my first visit to Scandinavia as a 19-year-old with an Interrail pass. I love this gentle, lacily smooth landscape of lakes and erratics now, but there was a slight tinge of disappointment for me back then. I think I secretly thought that the polar bears started at Malmö. Once it reopens after a crew change at Linköping, I take a little wander up to the buffet car where there's a very nice range of things, including veggie choices. It's not really the right time of day to try out the self-microwavable meals, but the halloumi and kohlrabi wrap is very pleasant as we tilt smoothly through the golden afternoon along the valley of the Svartan, deep in Småland province. Further lessons in Swedish pronunciation come with the announcements for our stop in the town spelt Nassjo, pronounced something like Nekra. Even more confusing is the Swedish electric locomotive in Amtrak livery parked outside the station. It spent 2 years in the 1970s doing test runs on the North East Corridor and has now had the livery it wore there restored by local enthusiasts. It's perhaps inevitable that when you're a nation of 95,000 lakes, you're going to get to the point where you just call one of them Big Lake. Storher. That's this one. It's quite big. Beyond Hässleholm, we're speeding through the flat, big field landscape of Skåne, Sweden's most southerly province, looking not dissimilar to Denmark across the straits. The name Skåne probably has the same derivation as Scandinavia itself, and the Romans thought this bit of southern Sweden was an island. I'm hopping off the X2000 at Lund, one stop before my train's Malmö terminus, to make a cross-platform connection onto the Denmark-bound train. Back on that Scandinavian trip as a 19-year-old, I stayed in this handsome university town in a youth hostel housed in an old sleeper carriage. I just realised, with relief, that the fellow guest who promised to send me some of his self-described esoteric poetry never did. You can tell we're nearly in Denmark because the trains have rubber rings on the front. This is not in fact a buoyancy aid in case they fall off the bridge. The Øresundstog network spreads across southern Sweden like an octopus with Copenhagen at its head, turning this transnational area into a single transpontine commuter zone. Having dived under neighbouring Malmö, we're soon out into the basement of the Øresund Bridge, road deck above us, mesmerising diagonal struts on either side. It all looks very grey and murdery today. There have been recent times when this Swedish-Danish border has not been very Schengen-y, despite the major commuter flows, but today is just another day, another krona with a different exchange rate. It amuses me that the artificial island in the Øresund where road and rail switch from bridge to tunnel is called Pepperholm, Pepper Island. It got that name because it's next to a larger natural island called Saltholm, so called because it's largely salt marsh. So what else would you call its neighbouring island? Past the airport and some Jenga-esque apartment blocks, and we're soon in the Danish capital, alighting amidst crowds of Danes carrying either bicycles or cycle helmets at Copenhagen Hovedbanegård, another absolutely fantastic bit of Nordic station design. That timbered roof, those chandeliers, tradition in the service of modernity. Just ignore the garish Dunkin' Donuts, okay? To add to the internal joys of the Hovedbanegård, it's surely the only European capital city main station where you can step outside and be immediately confronted with amusement park rides, courtesy of across the road Tivoli Gardens. I have an hour here, so I embark on the fastest whistle-stop tour of all the must-see sights of Copenhagen. You may not agree that these are the must-see sights. More magnificent municipal brickwork at the Rådhus, along with lots of cyclists. Cobbled streets with tall houses and lots of bicycles. Borgen, aka Christiansborg Palace, which claims to be the only building in the world to house all three branches of a national government, and namesake of the TV show from which I learnt most of my Danish swearing vocabulary. And the automated metro, which didn't exist last time I was here. And back to the Hovedbanegård and its cosy lamplit aura for a train deeper into Denmark. It's the first diesel train in the journey, thanks to Denmark's surprising historical reticence to electrify very many of its main lines. This is a Lunator, a lightning train, which is DSB's fancy name for an ordinary intercity that makes a few fewer stops. But there's nothing very ordinary about Danish intercity trains. For a start, the seats are larger than some central London flats, so much so that I wonder what shenanigans went on in them to require these signs on the windows. Once he's done the job checking my ticket, the guard gets on with the more important work of coming round first class with a random basket of pesto crisp bread sandwiches. The good thing about being on this train, speeding non-stop across the surprisingly dark island of Zealand, is that Emergency Plan 1, oh no, Norway's Nordlandsbanen has fallen into a hole, and Emergency Plan 2, oh no, now the Swedish Northern Main Line has been washed away, converged upon it. In the dark, only the flashing of exit lights in the tunnel gives away that we've crossed the Great Belt Link, another combined tunnel and bridge combining Zealand and Fyn Islands. It's hard to believe that in my lifetime, every train to Copenhagen used to have to be loaded onto a ferry. Our first stop is at Odense, home of Hans Christian Andersen. Then we're over the Little Belt and onto the European mainland in the form of the Jutland Peninsula. We lose a few carriages at the junction station of Fredericia and counterintuitively head north for a bit. I'm going to admit I'd never heard of the Danish town of Vejle before I planned this journey, but we're leaving the train here to let it growl on northwards towards Aarhus. Vejle is apparently called the Manchester of Denmark. It had lots of cotton mills, because apparently every nation needs a Manchester, a Paris and a Venice. There's maybe a passing miniaturised resemblance between the town hall and Manchester's, but the silent streets do lack something in the Mancunian vibe. So what am I doing in this sleepy Jutland erstwhile manufacturing town? Well, what am I ever doing in sleepy towns in the run-up to the witching hour? Waiting for a bright green bus, of course. Only 10 minutes late, Flixbus N150 pulls up for the small waiting crowd at Vejle. This is a busy overnight bus for Hamburg, Berlin and Krakow, but its terminus is a little Polish village called Medyka, which just happens to be on the Ukrainian border. I guess Flixbus Polska lacked the insurance and or will to go any further. Under a hazy moon, we're speeding south along the E45 motorway. I'm using the coach as the alternative to either unreliable sleeper trains or a long chain of regional trains with lots of connections to miss. A single-seat journey into Schleswig-Holstein was tempting. Indeed, so pivotal is this coach that we are now back on my originally planned route for the first time since Honningsvåg by the North Cape. In slightly more excitement than I expected, the Flixbus nearly got pretty firmly stuck behind an accident on the spur motorway to Koling. Luckily, Danish motorways don't have barriers down their central reservations. The subsequent diversion delays us a bit, as is an apparent inability to get a diesel pump at a petrol station to work. Given the allegedly temporary emergency reintroduction of border checks by Germany, I'm pleasantly surprised when we glide non-stop through the border post at Kupfermühle, but I'm speaking too soon. Instead, when we stop at Flensburg railway station, which is weirdly at the end of a cobbled road, Polizei appear for a pretty thorough check of passports and IDs. At least there's no racial profiling, as it's a universal check. But this means more delays, and as we head deeper into Germany over the 49-metre high Rada high bridge across the Kiel ship canal, along which two freighters churn far below us, I'm beginning to get a bit worried about my connection in Hamburg. It's not fatal if I don't catch the 0438 train, but if tomorrow is going to not be a nail-biting race across Germany and France, it would be very helpful. At 0427 we creep past Hamburg Dammtor station. If they'd only let me off here, my train also stops here at 0430. We need green lights all the way to the bus station. They largely oblige, and at 0432 we're swinging into the Zentrale Omnibusbahnhof. This is next door to the Hauptbahnhof, but they're both huge sites, and bus and train are inevitably at the far end of both. I'm very grateful to whoever put in a second set of stairs down for each platform from the Steintor Dam Bridge. You're possibly a lifesaver. Against the odds, we just made it to the most distant platform at the Hauptbahnhof. This journey, sadly, won't go to Switzerland, but if I won't go to the mountains, instead they'll come to me. Just as we travelled from Denmark to Germany and a bit of Poland, so a bit of Switzerland will glide us across northern Germany. Eurocity 7, on which we are now comfortably ensconced, had a brief moment of minor infamy earlier this year. This used to be a through train from Hamburg to Interlaken. Then the Swiss Railways announced that their patience had snapped with this and several other trains from Germany. They were turning up at the border late from their journey through Germany so often that it was messing up their neat clock-faced timetables. From now on, Eurocity 7 would be curtailed at the first station over the border at Basel. It's, unsurprisingly, a quiet train as the clock spins towards 5 AM. We get to watch Westphalia slowly awaken and dawn break over the northern German plains. I will sing this train's praises now while it's still on time, before it inevitably starts picking up delays on the journey through the congested hubs of the Ruhrgebiet. As well as the comfy seats, the other great joy of Eurocity 7 is that it brings a Swiss dining car over 800 kilometres from the nearest canton for breakfast each morning. So I'm tucking happily into the meal deal known as the Muntermacher, Le Bon Départ, and Gradevole Inizio, or a Kickstarter, depending on your preferred Helvetic or Helvetic adjacent language. It's turning into a soggy morning. Until this journey past packed Münster-bound platforms, I hadn't realised how every German schoolchild comes with an attached umbrella. A man who clearly hasn't been on a train for a decade asks the restaurant bar attendant where the smoking carriage is. Frustrated, the passenger blames the lack of one on it being a Swiss train. We are, of course, losing time through the Ruhrgebiet cities. Welcome to Spielstadt Essen, announces the platform signs. It took me a long time to discover that this not hugely well-known Nord Rhine-Westphalian town's outsized presence in board games is due to its status as a board game convention host. Hours spent trying to save Essen from a pandemic certainly helped get me through the pandemic. I'm sitting over my second cup of coffee trying to decide which of today's routing options to put my faith into. They all have an element of wandering around thanks to a bit of buffer time, and they all involve the vagaries of Deutsche Bahn a bit. It's practically a coin toss. We clatter over the Hohenzollern Bridge across the Rhine and into Köln Hauptbahnhof 10 minutes late in the shadow of the Dom. Balance out what I said yesterday, it's almost as iconic a rail approach as Stockholm's. One option has me leaving this train here, but I'm going to trust that the delay won't grow further to endanger my next connection, and stay on Eurocity 7 a bit longer, though I'm starting to regret that a little when it starts partaking in the quintessentially German activity of an express train tiptoeing past the cabbages. Picking up speed again, we're now racing down a narrowing Rhine valley, past Remagen, where war film buffs will know that there isn't a bridge. Apparently, the locals have spent the last 80 years objecting to any replacement of the destroyed bridge on the grounds that it would spoil the view. Still further down the valley, and the Deutsche Bahn app is equivocating as to whether the delay is going to make me miss the connection at Koblenz. When we finally roll into the platform, it says it will be missed, but the sprint through the underpass proves it wrong. There must be a German word for the smug feeling that comes with proving the Deutsche Bahn app wrong. The guard on the Trier train examines my pass. "I hope you're having enough time to see Europe properly," he says. "Some of our," and here he adopts a theatrical whisper, "North American friends tell me we are seeing Europe in a week. How can you do that?" I don't dare tell him the true nature of my journey. The journey up the Moselle Valley will probably be even more stunning in a few weeks' time when the vines and trees start to turn, but it's wonderful enough today as we overtake the mixture of gritty barges and dazzling white river cruise ships on this branch of the Rhine highway. It's slightly too early for me to partake in one of the little bottles of Moselle wine on the refreshment trolley, but the attendant does time his passage for the most tempting moment in our journey through the vertiginous vineyards. Trier was Augusta Treverorum to the Romans and birthplace to Karl Marx. For us, it's just a place to hop off one train and onto the waiting little red unit in the bay platform, heading for an obscure town called Pell, which would be a lot less obscure if geopolitics had played out slightly differently. It's a 50-minute run down this lovely line. More Moselle, more vines, more pretty villages. For much of the journey, the vines of a country famous for producing wine stare across the river to the very similar-looking vines of a country that really isn't. Perl is the border station for Germany and France, but for reasons of funding, bureaucracy and rolling stock incompatibility, passenger trains only run across the frontier on a Saturday. So it's the sleepy terminus of my train. But I'm not going to France just yet. Well, I can hardly not come to Schengen, given it's sort of on the way. With a little over 100 hours to go, will our next complex series of buses, trains and boats hang together? Can we avoid our journey being derailed by landslide, strike or storm? And where is the end of the longest journey in the Schengen Zone? Find out in the second and final instalment of Schengen 200, coming next week. Or it's probably already been published if you're watching this any time after November 2025, and there'll be a link in the description or on the screen now. You'll find it.